August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radios across Japan, announcing unconditional surrender. The Japanese soldiers who had been captured across Pacific Islands, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Okinawa, expected a fate worse than death once in enemy hands. For years, imperial propaganda had told them terrifying stories of what awaited those unlucky enough to fall into American captivity: brutal torture, forced labor unto death, starvation in cages, and endless humiliation. Many of the men had grown up on such stories, and their imaginations painted dark pictures as they were lined up, disarmed, and marched into captivity. Their eyes scanned the American Marines and Guards, noting the discipline but also the strange casualness with which the Americans treated their captives. Instead of bayonets and beatings, the soldiers offered water, cigarettes, even attempts at broken communication. Still, the prisoners remained deeply suspicious. This had to be some elaborate deception. They assumed the true cruelty would reveal itself once the long journey to America ended. The transports themselves were another surprise. Instead of being crammed into suffocating holds with barely any air, many found themselves aboard organized ships, guarded but not abused. They were given food, rice, canned meat, bread, and allowed to rest on deck. For men raised under wartime scarcity where even officers went hungry, such treatment was baffling. They whispered among themselves, why waste food on the enemy? Why show any consideration to men who had tried to kill them? The answers eluded them, and suspicion lingered. Perhaps the Americans wanted to keep them healthy for brutal labor in mines. Perhaps this was temporary kindness before harsher punishment began. Some even believed they were being preserved for medical experiments, so deeply ingrained were the horror stories from military indoctrination. As they crossed the Pacific, staring at the vast ocean that separated them from their homeland, a heavy silence often filled the decks. These men had trained to die for the emperor, to follow orders without question, to see themselves as divine warriors of an unbreakable empire. Now they were prisoners, powerless, and uncertain of what future awaited. America was not a land they had imagined visiting under such circumstances. Many thought of America only as a distant industrial giant, a place of skyscrapers, strange music, and motion pictures they had heard about but never seen. Yet here they were, not as conquerors but as captives. The first glimpses of the American coastline stirred a mix of dread and curiosity. Towering harbors, sprawling cities untouched by bombs, and endless rows of factories confirmed the stories of American industrial might. The prisoners were struck by the sheer scale of everything: the cranes, the ships, the highways stretching into the distance. Even before arriving at their designated camps, they sensed the vastness of the United States and the resources at its disposal. To Japanese soldiers who had fought desperately with dwindling supplies, watching comrades starve on isolated islands, the contrast was painful. Once loaded onto buses and trucks, the journey inland began. Through the windows they saw landscapes unlike anything in Japan: wide open plains stretching farther than the eye could see, endless roads, and small towns with electric signs and automobiles parked in neat rows. Children sometimes waved as convoys passed, and locals occasionally gathered to glimpse the enemy soldiers. The prisoners, in turn, watched with fascination at the abundance visible in ordinary American life. If this was the land of their captors, what did that say about the war they had fought? The questions grew louder in their minds. Arriving at the camps was another revelation. Rows of wooden barracks, mess halls, medical stations, and even recreation areas greeted them. They expected barbed wire, yes, but behind it there were organized facilities rather than torture chambers. Instead of being beaten or starved, they were processed efficiently, assigned bunks, and given clean uniforms. Some still suspected cruelty hidden behind the orderliness. Others began to wonder if perhaps America's strength lay not only in its weapons, but in its ability to treat even its enemies with a strange kind of systematic humanity. This was only the beginning. In the months ahead, Japanese prisoners would discover more shocks, more contradictions, and more moments that challenged everything they thought they knew about their captors. Yet even now, as they lay in their bunks that first night, full stomachs and exhaustion pulling them toward sleep, whispers moved through the barracks. If this is a prison camp, what comes next? None of them could have guessed that the next surprise would involve the flickering glow of a movie screen. The first days inside the American camps were a study in contrasts. The Japanese prisoners had braced themselves for shouting guards, degrading punishments, and endless hunger. Instead, they were confronted with order and routine. Roll calls were strict, but they were not accompanied by beatings. The guards carried rifles, but often stood at ease, sometimes even nodding politely rather than barking commands. The camp fences were topped with barbed wire, yet the air smelled of cooked meals drifting from the mess hall. Inside the barracks there were cots lined neatly, mattresses stuffed with real bedding, and even heating stoves for colder seasons. It was hardly luxurious, but it was far from the nightmare they had imagined. Meals shocked them most of all. Prisoners had expected thin soups or moldy rice, the kind of rations many Japanese civilians were forced to endure during the war's final months. Yet trays carried into the dining halls contained substantial portions: rice, vegetables, fish, bread, tea, even fruit on occasion. The abundance seemed impossible. Men who had fought in jungles on a diet of handfuls of rice and whatever they could forage now sat with plates that looked almost like home-cooked meals. Some initially refused to eat, convinced the food must be poisoned or contaminated, but hunger overcame suspicion, and soon disbelief turned into quiet, guilty gratitude. Rumors spread in hushed Japanese: "They feed us better than our own army ever did." Beyond food, the camps contained unexpected touches of normal life. The Red Cross delivered packages with soap, toothbrushes, even writing materials. Medical clinics offered treatment for wounds and tropical diseases. Guards occasionally distributed cigarettes, and some camps even had small collections of books, though few prisoners could read English. The prisoners were stunned to discover they were allowed to write letters home, though carefully censored. The very act of putting brush to paper and hoping for a reply felt like a miracle, restoring a fragile link to the world they thought lost forever. Discipline existed, of course. Escape attempts were punished and curfews were enforced, yet the punishment was often confinement rather than brutal violence. The Americans seemed more concerned with maintaining order than inflicting cruelty. This attitude unsettled the prisoners deeply. They had been taught that the Americans were savage barbarians, incapable of honor or fairness. Instead, they found themselves living under rules that, while strict, carried a strange sense of consistency. The camps were designed to contain men, not to destroy them. Even the physical surroundings baffled them. Many camps were located in rural areas of California, Texas, and other western states. Through the fences, the prisoners could see endless farmlands, mountains, and small towns. Farmers sometimes worked nearby fields, and in some places, prisoners were sent out under guard to help with agricultural labor. They were shocked to see American civilians treating them not with hatred, but with a curious indifference, as if they were just another group of workers passing through. Children sometimes waved at them. Women occasionally brought baked goods to guards, and the sight of such casual normalcy unsettled men who had believed America was nothing but a land of vengeful enemies. At night, when the barracks grew quiet, many whispered about the strange situation. "Is this really captivity?" one would ask. Another would reply, "Maybe they are preparing us for something worse." Yet others began to suggest a more dangerous thought: maybe what we were told about America was completely wrong. Seeds of doubt sprouted in these quiet conversations. For men trained to see the world in absolutes, the empire as divine and the allies as demons, the everyday decency and comfort of camp life threatened to erode the certainty that had once seemed unshakable. Still, no one could have foreseen what would come next. The Americans, it seemed, were not content with providing food, shelter, and safety. They had something else in mind. Something so unexpected, so strange, that many Japanese prisoners thought it was some kind of trick. They would soon gather in large halls or outdoor areas, and for the first time since leaving their homeland, they would be transported far beyond the fences of their camp, not by escape, but by the shimmering images projected onto a movie screen. The rhythm of camp life soon settled into routines that both comforted and confused the Japanese prisoners. Days began with roll call, followed by meals that continued to astonish men used to starvation rations back home. Work details filled the hours for many, often assisting on nearby farms or helping maintain the camp itself. For soldiers who had spent months in muddy foxholes or hiding in jungle caves, performing agricultural labor under the American sun felt almost like a strange reprieve. They were guarded, yes, but the work was reasonable, the treatment fair, and in return they were fed regularly. Some even joked quietly among themselves in Japanese, "If this is prison, what does freedom look like?" Leisure hours proved even more disorienting. Instead of endless punishment drills or enforced silence, there were spaces for recreation. Baseball fields and volleyball courts appeared inside the fenced compounds, with prisoners forming teams and staging matches. American guards sometimes watched, occasionally cheered, and a few even tried to teach the Japanese the rules of baseball. There were card games in the barracks, and those who could draw or carve were allowed to pursue their crafts. A few camps organized small groups where men practiced traditional Japanese songs, their voices carrying over the wire in the evenings. The atmosphere was surreal. Men who had fought bitterly across Pacific Islands now spent their evenings singing folk songs or playing sports, as if the war existed in some distant memory. Clothing too defied expectation. Issued camp uniforms were simple but clean, with sturdy shoes and jackets for colder months. Compared to the ragged, lice-infested gear some had worn during their final battles, it was a blessing. Hygiene facilities offered soap, showers, and even barber services. Japanese soldiers who had lived in caves, eating insects and drinking rainwater, were astonished at the basic dignity afforded them here. Some whispered nervously, "Why are they treating us so well? What do they want from us?" Suspicion lingered, but the reality remained undeniable. Their American captors seemed more interested in keeping them healthy and orderly than in breaking them. Meals continued to provide endless conversation. The availability of white rice, fresh vegetables, protein, and bread stunned men who knew their families back home struggled to find even sweet potatoes. Rumors circulated that prisoners were fed nearly the same rations as American soldiers themselves. Some even felt crushing guilt writing home about their meals, knowing their mothers, wives, and children lived under severe rationing and American bombing. Yet the abundance also planted new doubts. How could Japan possibly have won against a nation capable of feeding its enemy prisoners this well? Entertainment came in smaller forms at first. Censored newspapers occasionally allowed into the camp revealed snippets of a world outside. Many prisoners were surprised by how openly American papers seemed to criticize their own government and military. This freedom of expression contrasted sharply with the rigid propaganda machine of the empire. A few books in camp libraries offered glimpses of American literature, though the language barrier prevented most from reading them. Still, slowly, an unexpected picture of America emerged, a place of contradictions, but not the barbaric wasteland they had been taught to fear and hate. Yet the greatest shock was still on the horizon. In the evenings, when the camp's routine slowed and the men gathered with restless energy, the Americans began offering something beyond baseball fields and books. Prisoners were summoned to large halls or open areas under the stars. A projector was wheeled in and set up. A white sheet hung across a wall or between poles. And soon, beams of light cut through the darkness. At first, the Japanese prisoners did not believe what they were seeing. Moving images, larger than life, flickered into view. The Americans were letting their enemies watch motion pictures, not propaganda, not military lectures, but actual Hollywood films. For men trapped behind wire, it was as if a portal to another world had suddenly opened. The disbelief that had begun with food and comfort now reached stunning new heights. Could this truly be happening? When the first reels began to spin inside the camps, silence fell over the gathered prisoners. They had expected speeches, ideological lectures, perhaps even heavy-handed propaganda designed to humiliate them or break their spirit. Instead, the flickering light revealed cowboys riding across endless plains, comic actors stumbling through absurd misadventures, and glamorous performers dancing and singing in ways the soldiers had never imagined. The shock was immediate. For many, this was their first time experiencing American cinema at all, and the contrast to the rigid propaganda films of the empire was overwhelming. Instead of military parades and patriotic speeches, there was laughter, music, and pure fantasy. It was as if a piece of another universe had been delivered straight through the barbed wire. The guards standing at the edges of the makeshift theaters watched with a mix of amusement and curiosity. They saw the hardened faces of enemy soldiers soften into smiles, chuckles, and at times open laughter. Some prisoners clapped during slapstick scenes, while others sat wide-eyed at the sheer scale and spectacle of the productions. For Japanese men who had grown up under strict military discipline and years of total war, the sudden immersion in stories of adventure, romance, and comedy felt intoxicating. Hollywood had crossed the fences and reached them where no weapon could. Not every reaction was simple amusement. Some soldiers grew deeply uneasy at the casual freedom portrayed on screen. They saw men and women openly flirt, workers question their bosses, and poor characters rise above misfortune through wit and individual courage. Such scenes contradicted everything they had been told about America, that it was a land of moral corruption, chaos, and spiritual decay. Instead, they glimpsed a society where even ordinary people seemed to have dreams, dignity, and the freedom to pursue them. This contradiction gnawed at them in the dark as the projector clicked steadily away. Could it be that their leaders had lied about the enemy all along? Newsreels added another layer of surprise. While carefully chosen by the Americans, they often showed the war effort, bustling factories, fleets of ships, squadrons of aircraft, or soldiers marching with confidence and abundant equipment. For prisoners who knew firsthand how desperate supplies had become in the empire, these images were almost unbearable. The sheer abundance of machinery, the rivers of tanks and planes rolling off assembly lines, the crowds of well-fed workers all served as brutal reminders that the empire could never have outproduced its enemy. Yet even these revelations were delivered not with cruelty, but almost casually, tucked between scenes of comedies and musicals. The Americans seemed to understand that the power of cinema lay not in lectures but in the steady accumulation of images that undermined old beliefs without a single word of argument. What astonished the prisoners most was that attendance was voluntary. No one forced them to sit before the screen. They could choose to remain in their barracks, to write letters or play cards instead. Yet the halls quickly filled whenever the projector was set up. Word spread rapidly after each screening. Tonight they are showing another Western, or tomorrow a musical. Men who once had been willing to die charging American machine guns now found themselves eagerly anticipating evenings of American entertainment. Some began to keep mental lists of favorite actors or genres, comparing notes with fellow prisoners. Others admitted with a mix of shame and wonder that for a few hours they forgot they were captives at all. In the glow of the screen, something subtle shifted. The barbed wire faded into mental background and the war felt distant and almost unreal. The men were no longer just prisoners of conflict. They were spectators of stories larger than themselves, transported to worlds of possibility and imagination. The Americans, whether intentionally or not, had given them a powerful gift, a window into a world of creativity and humanity that no prison wall could fully contain. And as the credits rolled and the lights came up, the disbelief lingered like smoke in the air. They could not understand why their enemies allowed such indulgence, such escape. Yet deep down they knew they would never forget the nights when Hollywood came to the camps, when the enemy showed them not cruelty but beauty. The nights of film screenings became a rhythm that prisoners clung to with quiet, almost guilty anticipation. Word would ripple through the barracks when the guards announced another showing, and men who spent their days working in fields or repairing equipment suddenly found themselves hurrying through dinner just to secure a good viewing spot in front of the projector. For those trapped behind barbed wire, these evenings offered an escape no tunnel could provide. The flickering light on the screen dissolved the fences, if only for 2 hours. The men sat cross-legged on the ground or leaned against barrack walls, staring into a world that felt brighter, freer, and more alive than anything they had known even before the war. The variety of films astounded them. Comedies featuring performers whose names they couldn't pronounce sent ripples of laughter through crowds of men who had not laughed freely in years. Westerns, with their sprawling landscapes and clear battles between heroes and villains, felt like moral tales painted against backdrops larger than life itself. Musicals, with their elaborate dance numbers and glittering costumes, produced a different kind of shock, the sheer extravagance of a country that could afford to turn life into song and spectacle while fighting a global war. And then there were romances, where women with dazzling smiles spoke lines filled with wit and confidence. Japanese soldiers who had been raised under rigid codes of honor and gender roles sat in stunned silence at these portrayals of independent women, so different from the carefully controlled images in imperial propaganda. For some, the experience bordered on dangerous fascination. They found themselves discussing favorite scenes during work details, attempting to imitate comedic gestures, or humming melodies long after the credits had rolled. To enjoy enemy culture so openly felt almost like betrayal of everything they had been taught, yet the human pull of entertainment was too strong to resist. Even officers who tried to discourage too much enthusiasm could not deny the magnetic pull of the screen. When the lights dimmed, rank vanished. Hardened veterans sat beside teenage conscripts, all equally absorbed by the world unfolding before them. The contrast to the films of the Empire was stark and undeniable. In Japan, cinema had been a weapon, a tool to glorify the emperor, the military, and the eternal struggle against Western influence. Stories were rigid, predictable, heavy with ideology and sacrifice. Here, the Americans seemed almost careless in their creative freedom. Films could mock authority, satirize the wealthy, or celebrate the triumph of ordinary individuals. The prisoners whispered to one another in Japanese, "How could such apparent chaos produce a nation strong enough to defeat us?" Yet the more films they saw, the more they realized that this creative chaos was not weakness. It was a kind of vitality and confidence they had never known. Some men began to mention the screenings in letters home, though censorship prevented full descriptions. "We are shown strange entertainments," one hinted carefully, "that make us forget for a while where we are." Families back in Japan, surviving on ration cards and government-controlled news, could scarcely imagine such a thing. The very idea that captured soldiers might be watching American movies sounded absurd, almost insulting to those suffering at home. Yet within the camps, the screenings became one of the most discussed privileges, almost a currency of morale and hope. And so the disbelief deepened with each showing. The Japanese prisoners, taught to expect nothing but cruelty from the enemy, found themselves instead immersed in laughter, music, and stories of human possibility. It was not freedom, but it was a taste of something dangerously close to it. Each night at the movies left them both grateful and profoundly unsettled, wondering why their enemies allowed such indulgence and what effect it might be having on their own loyalties, their own understanding of the world. The screen was no longer just entertainment. It had become a silent teacher, reshaping how they saw the world, themselves, and the nation they had once been willing to die fighting. As weeks turned into months, the nightly screenings began to shape something far more profound than mere amusement. The prisoners found themselves talking endlessly about what they had seen, analyzing not just the plots, but the values embedded within them. A comedy might spark debates about American humor, which seemed rooted in celebrating underdogs and mocking pompous authority. A Western would ignite conversations about concepts of justice, individual courage, and the vast open landscapes that symbolized possibilities far beyond rigid military discipline. Even romances, dismissed at first as frivolous, revealed something deeply unsettling: the open display of affection, the independence of women, and the casual social interactions suggested a society far less controlled than the one they had left behind. Slowly, imperceptibly, the films were chiseling cracks into the hardened beliefs drilled into them by years of imperial indoctrination. The guards noticed the transformation occurring behind the wire. The hostility of new arrivals, once sharp and defiant, dulled over time. Prisoners who had shouted about eventual Japanese victory now grew quieter, their certainty visibly shaken. Instead of dreaming about returning to a triumphant empire, many whispered about whether such a life of abundance, creativity, and freedom could truly exist beyond the fences. The films planted images of stores overflowing with goods, of ordinary Americans laughing in theaters, of music echoing through dance halls. These images stood in brutal contrast to the ration lines, bombed cities, and atomic devastation the prisoners knew awaited them back home. Another answered quietly, "Perhaps it is not propaganda at all. Perhaps this is simply how they actually live." Even the most disciplined among them could not fully resist the pull. Officers who tried to frame the films as mere propaganda struggled when their men pointed out how utterly different these reels were from the stiff ideological productions they had grown up watching. "If this is propaganda," one soldier muttered after a musical, "then it is the most beautiful propaganda I have ever seen." These conversations revealed the dangerous potential of entertainment as a weapon of ideas. It bypassed ideology and touched directly on human longing and imagination. The Americans may not have consciously intended it as psychological warfare, yet the effect was undeniable and profound. The more the prisoners laughed at American comedies, the harder it became to see the United States as a faceless demonic enemy. The more they admired characters overcoming hardship through individual initiative, the more they questioned the imperial claim that only absolute obedience and sacrifice led to strength. Films about communities uniting voluntarily, about individuals defying corrupt leaders, or about ordinary people achieving greatness through determination, all challenged the authoritarian worldview they had carried into captivity like armor. Letters Home, though heavily censored, hinted at these profound shifts. Families reading between the lines sensed that captivity in America was not the grim torture they had expected. Some prisoners described how the films reminded them of peacetime, of moments in their youth before war consumed everything. What began as mere entertainment had turned into cultural fascination and quiet revolution of thought. For younger soldiers especially, the movies were intoxicating and transformative. Teenagers who had been raised in militaristic schools saw in Hollywood a different kind of heroism, not bound to uniform and unquestioning loyalty, but to individuality, creativity, and moral courage. They scribbled names of actors in notebooks, learned English phrases from repeated screenings, and even tried to imitate the confident swagger of American cowboys and detectives. Others confessed privately to trusted comrades that they dreaded leaving the camp one day, fearing they would never again experience such abundance, such creative freedom, such moments of pure escape and imagination. The glow of Hollywood had seeped into their thoughts like water into stone, undermining old certainties, opening new questions. They had entered the camps as soldiers of the Emperor, willing to die rather than surrender. Now, slowly and against their will, they were becoming men who could no longer look at the world in the same absolute way. The disbelief of the first screenings gave way to something more lasting and dangerous, a quiet transformation of worldview that no amount of military discipline could fully reverse. Barbed wire still enclosed their bodies, but in their minds horizons were expanding beyond anything the Empire had ever allowed them to imagine. The Americans had discovered, perhaps by accident, or perhaps by design, that cinema could soften even the hardest of enemies, not with force or lectures, but with story, laughter, and the irresistible power of imagination. As the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion and news of Japan's surrender reached the camps, the prisoners began to imagine what life would be like once the gates finally opened and they were shipped back to their devastated homeland. For many, the thought of returning home filled them with as much dread as hope. Letters and Red Cross updates made it clear that their families were enduring unimaginable suffering, cities reduced to ash by firebombing, 2 atomic weapons unleashed, starvation spreading across the islands, and the once proud empire now occupied by foreign powers. The contrast between the reality waiting at home and the strange comforts of captivity in America weighed heavily on their minds. And among the many stories they would carry back, none seemed more unbelievable, more surreal than the nights they spent watching American movies behind barbed wire. When repatriations finally began, groups of men boarded ships once more, this time to cross the Pacific in the opposite direction. They crowded on decks, staring at the vast ocean, knowing they were leaving behind not just America, but the peculiar suspended life they had lived within its prison camps. They talked in hushed, almost embarrassed tones about the things they would miss: the food, the baseball games, the clean barracks, and above all the magical glow of the movie projector. "No one back home will believe it," one man said quietly. "They'll think we've lost our minds or been brainwashed." Another answered, "How can we tell them we laughed at American comedies while our cities burned to nothing?" The dilemma was profound and real. To speak openly about their camp experiences risked disbelief, anger, or even accusations of disloyalty to the emperor and the nation. Yet the story spread anyway, whispered in private. In villages across devastated Japan, returning prisoners told of their surreal captivity in careful, quiet words. They described nights when hundreds of men sat together in darkness watching performers whose names they couldn't pronounce light up enormous screens. They spoke of musicals filled with impossible color and energy, of cowboys galloping through landscapes that seemed to stretch forever, of romances that embodied a freedom they had never known even before the war. Families listened in astonishment and confusion, struggling to imagine their sons and husbands laughing at films while the empire collapsed in atomic fire around them. For many civilians enduring starvation and occupation, the accounts sounded like fantasy or worse, deliberate lies meant to diminish the suffering endured at home, or evidence of collaboration with the enemy. Still, the memories clung to the men who had lived them like ghosts they couldn't shake. Some former prisoners admitted privately that those screenings had altered forever how they thought about the world. They could no longer accept the simple story of righteous Japan versus evil America. They had seen another side of their enemy, not just its overwhelming military might, but its culture, its humor, its creativity, and its ability to turn life itself into art and entertainment, even while waging total war. Even as they walked through ruined streets and tried to rebuild their shattered lives, the glow of those movie screens followed them like persistent memories. It became a quiet marker of how profoundly their worldview had shifted, how the certainties they had once held had crumbled not under bombing, but under the gentle, persistent influence of stories and imagination. The most striking part of their accounts was how casual and ordinary the screenings had seemed to the Americans themselves. Guards set up projectors routinely, as though letting enemy prisoners watch Hollywood films was nothing particularly remarkable or strategic. To the Japanese, however, it had been extraordinary, a surreal inversion of everything they thought captivity and warfare should be. Some described it as the moment they first realized that America was not only a superpower of industrial production and military weapons, but also a superpower of culture, imagination, and soft power that could reach into hearts and minds where bullets could not. When asked later in life about their time in American prison camps, many veterans carefully skipped over details of labor or daily discipline. Instead, their voices softened noticeably when they spoke of cinema nights. For them, those hours had been more than distraction or entertainment. They were a reprieve from the crushing weight of defeat and shame, a glimpse of a different kind of future beyond militarism, and a memory that lingered long after the barbed wire was gone and they had returned to a homeland they barely recognized. In the years that followed Japan's reconstruction, the memory of cinema nights inside American prison camps became one of the strangest and most persistent legacies of the war for those who had lived it. For many former POWs, the image of sitting shoulder to shoulder with comrades watching American films under the watchful eyes of guards was etched as deeply in memory as the battles they had fought and survived. It was a paradox they carried with them for the rest of their lives. They had been enemies of America, taught to hate and fear everything it represented. Yet it was America that had allowed them moments of joy, wonder, and pure humanity in the darkest chapter of their existence. When historians later interviewed these aging men decades after the war, the subject of movies came up again and again unbidden. Some laughed about how they had memorized scenes from comedies or developed fascinations with Hollywood actresses they had never expected to see. Others spoke more seriously and thoughtfully, admitting that the films had been their first genuine glimpse of another world, one that contradicted completely the bleak picture painted by imperial propaganda. They remembered how those flickering reels had revealed a society that valued laughter, creativity, individual expression, and the freedom to imagine, qualities that had been nearly suffocated under the rigid military order of wartime Japan. The impact went far beyond individual memories and personal nostalgia. In post-war Japan, especially during the years of American occupation and Reconstruction, American culture began to flow more openly and rapidly into the country. Former POWs often became unintentional cultural ambassadors, telling family and friends about the films they had seen while in captivity. They described the humor, the music, the larger-than-life stories, and the sheer creative vitality of Hollywood. For younger Japanese hungry for something beyond the ashes of defeat and the shame of occupation, these accounts fueled intense curiosity about the United States and what it represented. The Marshall Plan and American aid may have rebuilt Japan's infrastructure and economy, but it was stories like these of laughter and wonder behind barbed wire that helped rebuild imaginations and opened minds to new possibilities. Some veterans even admitted openly in later years that their openness to democracy, to Western ideas, and to Japan's post-war alliance with America could be traced back in part to those nights in captivity. While no single film changed a worldview overnight, the steady exposure to American cinema had softened hardened soldiers in ways that bullets and bombs never could have achieved. The seeds planted in those makeshift prison theaters sprouted years and even decades later when former enemies found themselves part of a new Japan, allied with and deeply influenced by the very nation they had once fought to destroy. In that unexpected sense, the glow of the movie projector had been a quiet, almost accidental instrument of reconciliation and cultural transformation. Yet even decades later, disbelief never fully faded from their voices. Former prisoners would chuckle and shake their heads when recounting the experience to their children and grandchildren. "We were the enemy," they would say with wonder still evident in their aged voices. "We had tried to kill them, and they let us watch movies. They let us laugh and dream." To them it remained a powerful symbol of America's overwhelming confidence and abundance, a country so secure in its power that it could afford to entertain, even to enchant, its captives. It was also perhaps a reflection of something deeper and more profound, the idea that culture and imagination could be weapons just as potent, and perhaps more lasting than guns and tanks. The legacy of those screenings lived on not only in fading memories but in the cultural bridge they had helped build across an ocean of former hatred. Men who had once been willing to die charging American positions carried home a secret story of nights when laughter and music had filled prison halls, when the enemy had shown them not the cruelty they expected, but something far more disarming: beauty, creativity, and shared humanity. And in that strange, flickering light cast by a movie projector in a prison camp, they discovered that even in captivity, even in defeat, the human spirit could still respond to story and imagination. They learned that even in war, when everything seemed absolute and final, the seeds of peace and understanding could be planted in the most unexpected places: in the dark of a makeshift theater, in the glow of a screen, in the universal language of laughter and wonder that transcends all boundaries.